Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It was a few days before Christmas. I'd gone to a small holiday party with my coworkers at this cozy bar in the East Village. It wasn't anything fancy, just some cheap cocktails and finger foods. But it was a nice way to unwind after a long year. I wasn't planning to stay too late, but you know how it goes. One drink turned into two, and before I knew it, it was past midnight. The streets were quieter than I'd expected, but the festive lights and occasional car passing by made it feel less lonely. I hadn't felt uneasy at all up until that point. I only lived a few blocks away, and the subway felt unnecessary, so I decided to walk. The first few blocks were fine. I walked past the holiday displays and store windows, listening to the distant sound of Christmas music faintly coming from the bars around me. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, grateful for the warmth from the alcohol still in my system. There were a few other people on the street, but they weren't heading in the same direction as me. The streets felt emptier than usual for a Friday night, though. Maybe it was just the chill in the air that kept most people inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the city was unusually quiet. By the time I reached the corner of my street, I could see the silhouette of my apartment building in the distance. It was only a couple more blocks to go. But then, as it passed by a narrow alley on the left side, I saw him. At first, I didn't think much of it. There was a man standing in the alley, just a little way in, not far from the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. I glanced at him as I walked by, but didn't think anything of it. I mean, it was New York, and I'd seen my fair share of odd sights. Homeless people, people waiting for someone, people on their phones or smoking. Everyone seemed to have their own little corner of the city. But then, as I walked a few steps further, I felt something strange. My gut twisted. He was staring at me. It wasn't a glance or even a casual look. He was just staring. His face was mostly hidden in the shadows, but I could make out his outline clearly enough. It was like he wasn't looking at the street, or the lights, or anything around him. Just me. I thought I might be overreacting. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I'd had a few drinks after all. So I kept walking, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that started to creep up on me. But as I walked past the alley, I couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't taken his eyes off me. I sped up my pace, trying to put distance between us. I pulled out my phone, pretending to text someone, anything to make it seem like I wasn't alone or vulnerable. But the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I felt like I was being watched. I kept walking, trying to shake off the sensation that something was wrong. Maybe it was just the loneliness of the city at night, or the darkness that seemed to make every alley feel like a potential hiding place. But the feeling didn't stop. It grew stronger the further I went. I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was there, walking a few paces behind me. I could see the shape of him more clearly now. He wasn't tall, maybe around average height, and he was dressed in a long, dark coat that made him look even more out of place in the festive surroundings. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, but his pace matched mine perfectly. He wasn't running, but he wasn't strolling either. He was just walking. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Maybe he didn't even notice me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I was suddenly acutely aware of the sound of my own footsteps, the cold air rushing past me, and the unmistakable thud of his steps behind me. I didn't want to look too obvious, so I kept walking straight ahead. But I started to move toward the other side of the street. There wasn't any reason to, really. The street was empty, and I knew there was a crosswalk ahead. But I thought if I just crossed, maybe I could lose him. I didn't dare look back until I reached the curb. When I did, he was still there. I felt my stomach drop. He had crossed the street too. At this point, the paranoia had set in. I didn't know what he wanted, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut anymore. I didn't know if he meant me harm or if he was just a weird guy, but something in me knew that I didn't want to find out. I picked up my pace again, trying not to run, but moving faster than I had been before. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but the urge to get home was stronger than ever. Every step I took felt like one closer to safety, but the faster I went, the more it felt like he was gaining on me. His footsteps were louder now. It was a strange, rhythmless sound, like he was just waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the corner of a street and saw a small convenience store across the road. I didn't know why, but it felt like my only chance to get away. I rushed across the street, hoping to blend in, hoping maybe he'd pass by and keep walking. But when I got inside the store, I saw him at the corner of my eye. He had stopped across the street and was looking in. I grabbed a random pack of gum, pretending to browse. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I glanced at the cashier. He was busy with something on the register, and the store was practically empty. I thought about asking the cashier for help. Maybe I could tell him I was being followed, but I felt embarrassed. What if I was just overreacting? Then I saw the man walking past the store. He stopped. He turned around, and then he walked into the store. I had no choice. I couldn't let him see me go back out the door. I had to act fast. I shoved the pack of gum into my pocket and bolted out of the store. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I couldn't hear anything else. I ran the next few blocks to my apartment, my breath catching in my throat, my legs burning from the cold. I could feel him behind me again, just close enough to make me feel like I couldn't escape. I reached the entrance to my building and saw the faint glow from my apartment's windows. I was almost there, but before I could get to the door, I heard footsteps behind me, faster this time. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door, but I was shaking too much. I could feel him getting closer. I finally got the door open, but before I could close it, I felt something grab my arm. He was right behind me. He tried to shove his way inside, but I slammed the door shut in his face and locked it. I could hear him banging on the door, his voice low and harsh. But after what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign that he might come back. The sounds of New York outside my window were muffled, but my ears were straining for every noise, every possible hint that he was still out there. The next morning, I called the police, but they couldn't do much without more information. It felt like they didn't believe me, or just thought it was an overreaction. I never saw the man again. I don't know who he was, or what he wanted, but I couldn't bring myself to walk alone at night for a long time after that. It was supposed to be a normal Christmas Eve in New York City. The streets were filled with the usual holiday hustle. People rushing around, lights twinkling on every corner, and the scent of roasted chestnuts hanging in the air. I'd spent the day doing a little shopping, picking up last-minute gifts, and enjoying the festive atmosphere. It was late, almost 11 p.m., when I finally made my way back to my car. I had parked it in a somewhat quiet section of Midtown, just far enough from the crowds but still within walking distance of everything. It was cold, the kind of cold that cuts through your coat and makes your breath visible in the air. When I reached my car, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just my car sitting there. There were figures surrounding it. At first, I thought maybe they were just people. Maybe they were lost or waiting for a ride. But the more I looked, the more I realized. They were all wearing the same thing. Santa costumes. I don't know why it struck me as odd at first. I mean, it was Christmas, right? I had seen a lot of people in Santa costumes during the day. It's New York, after all. But something about this felt off. They weren't standing around laughing or chatting like you'd expect from people having a good time in their costumes. They were all eerily still. The Santa figures didn't seem to be talking to each other either. They just stood there, facing my car. Some were holding bags. Others just standing there with their hands by their sides. I can't really describe it, but it was unsettling. I froze for a second, trying to figure out what was going on. I didn't know whether to approach or turn back. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, a group of people taking a break or something. But as I walked closer, I noticed that their eyes were hidden. All of them wore big, fluffy white beards that covered their faces entirely. At first I thought maybe they were just wearing masks, but I didn't see any eye holes. I remember thinking it was strange that they could all be wearing these costumes without any visible eyes. I started to feel a tightness in my chest, a growing sense of unease. Why were they all gathered around my car like that? Why wasn't anyone talking? Why were they all facing me now? I wish I could say I had a clearer thought in my head, but all I could think was that I needed to get in the car and drive away. Fast. I tried to act normal as I approached, pretending nothing was wrong, but as I got closer to the car, one of the figures suddenly stepped forward. I couldn't see any facial expression, but I swear I felt like they were staring at me. Then another one stepped forward, and another. All of them moved closer to me, surrounding me like they were slowly closing in. I knew something wasn't right. My heart was pounding in my chest. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them on the ground. It was like time slowed down, but I could hear my breath getting faster and faster. Before I could bend down to pick up the keys, one of the Santas reached out and grabbed my arm. I tried to jerk away, but their grip was firm, like a vice. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. They weren't smiling. There was no cheer in their eyes, no holiday spirit. It was just cold. My heart dropped. They started pushing me toward the car. I pulled harder, screaming now. But the more I struggled, the more they pushed. One of them shouted something in a language I couldn't understand. I don't know how, but I finally broke free. I kicked and screamed, and somehow I got enough space between me and the figure who was grabbing me. I stumbled backward, bumping into the car as I tried to get away. In that split second, I did what I should have done much earlier. I turned and ran. I wasn't looking back. I just bolted toward the nearest streetlight, where there were a few people walking by. I screamed for help as I ran, but by the time I looked behind me, the Santas were gone. The street was empty again. The whole thing felt like a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The way they stood there, the way they moved in unison. It didn't feel like some weird holiday prank. It felt wrong. I don't know what their intentions were. Maybe it was all just some twisted joke. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I narrowly avoided something much worse. After that night, I haven't parked in that area since, and I make sure to stay around the crowds no matter what time of night it is. I never found out who they were, but I've never seen Santa in the same way again. It was late December in New York, and Christmas was just a few days away. The city was a mix of chaos and magic. Twinkling lights strung across lampposts, the faint smell of roasted chestnuts on street corners, and shoppers bustling about with bags full of gifts. I had just finished decorating my tiny apartment, a one-bedroom walk-up in Queens. My Christmas tree was artificial, but the way the lights twinkled on it made it feel festive enough. I'd been living alone for almost a year now, and while I loved my independence, the holiday season sometimes made the solitude feel heavier. That evening, I was wrapping a few last-minute presents. The apartment was warm, cozy even, thanks to my space heater. Outside, the wind howled, and the occasional sound of a car honking echoed in the distance. It was around 7 p.m. when my buzzer went off. I wasn't expecting anyone. I didn't have many friends in the city, and my family lived upstate. I walked over to the intercom, pressing the button to speak. "Hello?" A man's voice crackled through the speaker. "Delivery for you, ma'am." My heart sank a little. I hadn't ordered anything, at least not that I could remember. Maybe it was a surprise gift from someone. It was Christmas after all. Still, something about his tone felt off. It was hard to describe, but it lacked the usual cheer or professionalism you'd expect from a delivery driver. "Who's it from?" I asked, and he pointed to the package. There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach twist. "I don't know. I just deliver the packages." I hesitated. "What address is it for?" Another pause. 4B, right?" That was my apartment number, but his hesitation made me nervous. "Just leave it downstairs. I'll come grab it later," I said, trying to sound casual. "Sorry, ma'am. I need a signature," he replied. My gut was screaming at me now. Delivery drivers don't usually buzz up for signatures anymore. Most packages get left in the lobby or on the doorstep. I decided to buy some time. "Hold on. I'll be right there." I didn't head downstairs. Instead, I walked over to my front door and peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I couldn't see the main entrance from my apartment. I grabbed my phone and quickly texted my neighbor, Sarah, who lived in 4A. "Hey, did you hear someone buzzing?" She replied almost instantly. "Yeah, but I ignored it." "Why?" I explained the situation and she called me right away. "Don't open the door," she said firmly. "This sounds sketchy." I've heard about scams like this. People pretend to be delivery drivers to get into buildings. Her words made my heart race. "What should I do?" "Stay put," she said. "If he buzzes again, don't answer." Just as she said that, the buzzer went off again. My body froze, and I stared at the intercom as if it were about to attack me. Sarah must have sensed my panic. "Did you want me to come over?" she asked. "No," I whispered. "I'll be fine. Just stay on the line." The buzzer stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I thought maybe he had left. Then, I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, getting closer to my door. I felt my chest tighten as I crept back to the peephole. A man was standing there. He was wearing a brown jacket and a baseball cap, holding a package under one arm. He looked normal enough, but there was something off about the way he stood, like he was trying too hard to seem casual. I watched as he glanced up and down the hallway, then reached out and tried my doorknob. The sound of the knob jiggling made my blood run cold. "He's at my door," I whispered into the phone. "Call 911, Sarah said immediately. "Now." I ended the call and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line until they arrived. Meanwhile, the man was still outside. I heard him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. Then came the sound of something scraping against the lock. My hands shook as I gripped my phone tightly. "He's trying to break in," I told the operator. "Stay calm, ma'am. Officers are en route," she replied. The sound stopped for a moment, and I dared to look through the peephole again. He was crouched down, doing something near the bottom of the door. My mind raced. Was he trying to force it open? My apartment felt smaller and more suffocating by the second. Then, as suddenly as he started, he stopped. I heard footsteps again, this time heading back toward the stairs. I rushed to the peephole and saw him walking away, the package still under his arm. He didn't run or panic, just casually strolled out as if nothing had happened. The police arrived a few minutes later. They searched the building but couldn't find him. One of the officers told me that this kind of thing happens more often during the holidays. People take advantage of the increased deliveries to scam or rob others. They promised to keep an eye on the area and advised me to be cautious. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. I kept thinking about how easily he could have gotten in if I hadn't trusted my gut. Christmas didn't feel so magical anymore. Instead, it felt like a reminder of how vulnerable I really was, even in my own home. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.